So thank you and good morning. Pleasure to be here, be back again. It's good as always, kind of looking forward to it. Should be a fun conversation. I'd like to keep this as a good interactive chat, so if you don't mind, throw questions out at me. What I'll be covering today is some of the issues that confront us as a financial industry on timing and what we're doing about it. And I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to actually, poke around various different companies and see how they're all responding to all the different timing challenges. And one of the things that I do want to cover a little bit is what's the value of timing and why we want to do it for more than just purely because the regulator said so. That's never a particularly great reason. Maybe one you have to do, but not necessarily the one you want to do. So starting off, we're going to talk a little bit, obviously, about the compliance and what that means, what's ahead. And I'm going to take two different tacts. We have a good selection of speakers coming up later in the day, specifically from various government agencies and regulators. And they can speak to the letter of the rules much more effectively than I can. But I'm also going to try to fill in some of the more practical aspects and how what we're seeing is people interpreting it or how they're thinking about they should interpret some of these rules. Then we'll talk a little bit about what it all means for operations, how you run your shop on a day-to-day basis, how it can actually improve and help your overall operation in the long term. And then last but far from least, can you turn this thing that looks like it's a regulatory requirement into a revenue-producing thing? Can it help augment your quest for alpha? So what's the value of time? There's a tactical way to look at it, right? And that is just think in terms of the compliance people say, I have to do it. The operations say, it's the cost of doing business. I have no choice. I've got to plumb this out and deliver it. And it's clearly not revenue enhancing. If anything, it erodes the margin because it's just another big hunk of cost. But as I said, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Flip the conversation over, take it in reverse, and reorder everything. Think about it more about a strategic set of objectives that you can really benefit from. So think about the ability to do things such as use it to improve your revenue as opposed to a cost center purely. Think about how you could use this in terms of enhancing your operation and protecting your brand, something you really do care about if you're running a viable business. And last but far from least, if you do the first two and you really drive timing and use it to its max, the compliance issue almost comes along as a free ride. You've already put the infrastructure in, it's been cost justified against offsetting revenues, and oh, by the way, it meets all the regulatory compliance requirements that you might have. Yeah, essentially what we're doing there, as I said in compliance, is just, at the end of the day, trust but verify. We want to keep the honest folks honest. And let's focus on how we generate revenue instead. So, time, the new race to zero. We've all sat through this the last 8 to 10 years, and we've always talked about low latency, ultra low latency, super duper ultra low latency. But the reality is that race is slowly coming to an end for a number of reasons. And that is the gentleman on the picture to the right. We've hit the speed limit. We can build faster and faster switches, but the times that we're putting into those switches are getting lower and lower and approaching the length of cables. If you think about it, I don't think they're here. Oh, actually, there's one company here, offers a switch that has a phenomenal switching time. It's on the order of 8 to 10 nanoseconds. But think about that. That's 8 to 10 feet of cable. So really what you're challenged with now is that it's a cable battle. Who can make the shortest wire? And we've developed all the short routes, whether we use fiber or microwave between New York, Chicago. We've got preferred cable routes over to London, other ones across to Tokyo. We've sort of worked that for all we're capable of doing. And until we take down Einstein and replace him with Zefram Cochrane in, 2367, according to Star Trek lore, and we invent warp theory and faster than light computers, we're stuck with this speed limit for the time being. So that advance, if you will, in the financial industry as a way to seek enhanced revenue and seek alpha is slowly dying down. It's there, it's viable, the costs are getting higher, but at the same time, the rest of the industry is catching up with those pioneers. It used to be that you could step out there, buy a faster switch, gain a good chunk of alpha, and it would take another year or two for the balance of the industry to catch up, and then you'd do the next technology step. We're done with that. So where do we go from here? So what isn't changing, however, is information flow. Information flow is still there, it's increasing, it continues to increase exponentially, and more importantly, we're finding newer and richer sources of information. Now, it used to be that we only looked at the classic national market system, CTA feeds, and looked at the, the closing stock prices, et cetera, read them in the newspaper the next day and decided what to do with the market. Now, we're basing our trading decisions on what's coming across our Twitter feed to a certain extent. We know that injects volatility. If there's volatility, we know we can make money. It's as simple as that. So you can look at something like an opera system. It's quite capable of replacing quotes in well under a microsecond and does on a normal day. What that says is that a price quoted has a life expectancy of about 1 microsecond or less, and in some environments, significantly less than 1 microsecond. So you're working in a world where the data is remarkably perishable. By the time you get to 10 or 100 microseconds, it's very old news. So one of the things that becomes incredibly critical is when is now. And that almost sounds like a little skit out of, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Spaceballs, but there was this whole thing about when is now, then is now, now is the past, and so on and so forth. But it's incredibly important if you want to trade on a global basis. Knowing when is now and knowing how to execute a synchronized order on a global basis is a significant challenge. And the only way you can do that and achieve the revenues that come with that is with a globally synchronized timing system. So temporal coherency is the key to advanced trading algorithms now. This becomes the new frontier. We put down the old frontier of the race to zero latency and the network switching, and now we pick this one up. But there are challenges. Let's talk a little bit about the operations space for a moment, which is important. The system logging. This is where you really need to enhance your time performance significantly. If you don't, you don't know when is now. You can't correlate the events that have occurred within your own environment. You don't know whether or not you're running 50 nanoseconds behind or 10 milliseconds ahead. That becomes a challenge. Packet capture analysis remains critical. Again, there are lots of vendors out there that will give you instrumentation that will timestamp packets in your environment network down to some low number of nanoseconds. But that information is completely worthless if all the clocks that feed all those different pieces of instrumentation aren't perfectly synchronized or synchronized to an extremely high level of accuracy and precision. So that drives you to event correlation. This is another one that requires absolute time synchronization, especially on a global scale. Yes, you've got to know what your server in downtown Tokyo that you've placed in front of that exchange is doing compared to the server you've put in front of the LSE. Because one of the things you're going to start to think about is if I run the same executing algorithms on both servers, they should simultaneously come to the same position, and I can erase the global time delay due to distance simply by providing the same information to both servers on both sides of the planet. They will come to the same conclusion knowing that I should buy Tokyo, sell London, or whatever the answer should be, and execute that truly simultaneously if you can successfully correlate your clocks on a global basis. Protecting the brand is key. It's about a high-touch presence with the customer, continuous presence in the market. You can't lose track of where you are and say, okay, I just got to step out of the market for the next hour and a half while I figure it all out. That's unacceptable. And again, that becomes all based on time. And the time it takes you to go back into the market is based on how fast you can plow through your logs, figure out what went wrong, put it all back together, and restart your systems. And if you haven't synchronized your timing, you're just going to lose the trust of your customers and clients. So one of the side effects of doing this is indirectly and not intentionally is we're all starting to align on the same time basis on a planetary scale. So we're synchronizing with our competition. Now when we see that we get picked off in a trading environment, we can start to discern what was going on in that environment in a meaningful way. Just because we all know we're all pretty much using the same clocks. By default, for the most part, almost all of us use GPS as the reference. It's convenient, easy, put an antenna on the roof, you're ready to rock and roll. It's straightforward. Given that, it's very easy to know not only what you're doing in your environment, but also, frankly, what your competition is doing. When did they execute a trade? When did they send in a quote? That starts to become credible information to you, so it's a way for you to optimize your trading strategies. The other thing you have to guard against is perceived trading ahead. The last thing you want to do is be seen as executing orders before you even got a valid quote, especially if it looks like you are sort of feathering them in that last 100 or so milliseconds or maybe to 10 milliseconds before the quote comes out, you conveniently put it in order. How do you do that? Well, most times it's because the clocks are off, not because someone was actually doing something wrong. And how good is good enough becomes the next question. How accurate do we have to be? Much like the race to zero, we have to get as close to perfection as we can possibly get. When you're thinking about dealing with message rates that now talk about millions of messages per second, a timestamp of stamping something once every 50 milliseconds is virtually meaningless because you've passed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of messages have gone by all with the same timestamp. It's back to I don't know when is when and don't know what the correct order of the messages were. So we will, for the next few years, until we hit some reasonable physical limits, be in this race to see who can get the most accurate and precise timing sources. And it is about accuracy and precision, very much so. You have to look at the target and understand the difference between accuracy and precision. As you read through a lot of these regulations, they tend not to differentiate between accuracy and precision. You're going to hear in the MIFID environment, they talk a lot about synchronization to UTC at 100 microseconds, but timestamp at 1 microsecond. So will it be acceptable that my timestamp that goes in at 1 microsecond can vary by plus or minus 99 microseconds from timestamp to timestamp? No, because when someone reads the logs of that transaction, it's simply not going to make sense. But there's no definitive statement yet, at least not from the regulators. So one of the things as an industry we will have to figure out is just that. And there's a lot more here too. You see this in a lot of places. We see the CAT NMS system coming up and evolving, and it's got two very interesting sets of numbers in it. If you're an execution venue, a participant in their language, you have to hit, again, 100 microseconds with not an overly clear what your timestamp granularity should be, maybe a millisecond, but the industry members only have to hit 50 milliseconds. Well, now think about this scenario. So let's say you're fully compliant, you are aligned with UTC as a member at 50 milliseconds, the exchanges are running fully aligned at 100 microseconds, and then your internal compliance person comes to you and drops all these logs on your desk and says, how can this be? The exchange said we did it then, and you're saying we did it here, and your answer is, well, we're allowed to use a 500 times sloppier clock, so it's within that amount of error. You know how long that conversation is going to last, right? It's going to be, go fix it. So you've got a regulatory environment that's saying exchanges you have to be, or participants, to use the correct term, you have to be at 100 microseconds. The industry, you can be at 50 milliseconds. But as a practical matter, not by fiat or law, you're going to wind up being driven to 100 microsecond alignment because your internal people will not tolerate the fact that the participants' clocks are more accurate than you. Because obviously they want to know what went on in-house, right? They want to know, did somebody do something stupid? Did they do something wrong, accidentally or intentionally? And if their only reference is this one outside source on a global basis, that's not going to be acceptable. So you presenting thousands and thousands of timestamp data that's aligned to 50 milliseconds that can vary by plus or minus 50 milliseconds on every single timestamp, just, it won't work at the end of the day. So regardless of what's written into the rule book, there's going to be the rule book version, and then there's what's going to be the practical implementation. And I would also comment on something too. We're talking about a lot of numbers here and bouncing them around, but one of the things we should think about is the whole number. What's the right number? Where are we going longer term as an industry? Okay, what's next? So it seems like we've got this benchmark settling in at 100 microsecond alignment to UTC at the moment, okay? You got MIFID who's written it in, you've got CAT NMS that talks about that for the participant. We're tightening up on maybe in Europe a 1 microsecond time stamping, although we need to put some words around that to explain what we mean by the precision that's required for that, but we're getting there. The question is what's next? As a practical matter, for anybody that turns up a reasonable timing system, and by reasonable, I mean a GPS antenna or, you know, small grandmaster. So you spend $8,000 to $10,000, you're going to exceed those numbers so comfortably without even trying. You'd almost have to work at breaking it in some respects. Because if you go down the row here today with the vendors, you'll see those grandmasters will align to GPS within some low number of nanoseconds. 25 nanoseconds, 50, depends upon the vendor and the exact internal clock, but give or take, very tight alignment. So hitting 100 microseconds alignment to UTC is almost child's play once you make the decision that you're going to go off of internet-based time and use your own reference being GPS. Once you're there, so comfortably, could we as an industry then say the next step, and again, if you look at the NMS CAT plan, the wording is in there that says the provider and the processor will review the requirements on a yearly basis and put forward new requirements with the expectation that they should be tighter, is the general sense. They're going to go tighter because we're going to have this large blur or schmear around all the timestamps because 100 microseconds is almost infinity relative to our message processing rates. So the next one up, if I were to guess and speculate, would probably be on the 10 microsecond level because if you're using a reasonable GPS, and that gives you lots of room to still effectively deploy a very accurate clock system and for not a horrendous financial impact at the end of the day. So in my humble opinion, I think that's where we're headed, at least to 10 microseconds, if not beyond. There's another footnote that's in some of the regulations that's very interesting, which is they talk about a 1 millisecond time stamping on the US side, but if you happen to process and happen to carry a more precise clock, then you're expected to report with a more precise clock. So if you're already doing it, and as a practical matter, most firms do report much more, do carry much more precise clocks than 1 millisecond. I mean, if you're using a Unix-based system in one form or another and you pull a timestamp, it goes out a whole bunch of digits, well past a millisecond. So you've already got those numbers there already and are reportable. The question you have to ask yourself is just how precise is precise, and at what point do you cut it off where it's below the flutter or the noise floor. So at that point, I'm going to ask for questions. What didn't I cover? What can I answer for you? And if there aren't questions, are there questions? Oh, there has to be. Come on, Mark. Got to throw one in there.
I can ask a large number of questions. This whole stuff is, I mean, the immediate question is, what are the consequences of not complying, or at least complying at sort of the outer limit of, you know, the 50 milliseconds or the 100 micro? What are the consequences? What do you lose? And so are there legal implications for failing to comply?
There are, and it depends by country. We've got a few of the regulators coming on. We'll let them comment exactly what the rule of law says. But basically, if you carry it out and you're non-responsive and you don't follow the regulations, at some point they gig you for a rules violation, and there's a whole process as to where that goes. That eventually gets to various sanctions and fines, and I'll let the folks from the SEC, et cetera, comment on exactly that process, because that's a very legal definition, so let them have that. As a practical internal one, for most of the people, the technologists in the room, their internal people are going to take them to the woodshed long before it gets to that level. The first time the internal compliance folks and regulators see those numbers and they don't look right, they're not as good as an exchanges or better, they're just going to tell you to fix it. And you're not going to have a choice, because they'll just go back to the rest of the management committee and say, well, we can't safeguard whether or not we're exposed. We can't tell you whether or not we violate the rules or not. We can't tell you whether or not there's someone who's doing something nefarious with the trading. So therefore, that'll roll back downhill to the CTO that says, here, go fix it. And especially given that the price of fixing is not staggering. Now, obviously, it scales proportionate to the size of the company. But for the most part, I mean, think about the range you've got in terms of locking onto something as simple as a GPS receiver that supplies PTP. You've got people that'll cheerfully sell you a product. You Velcro the antenna to the window. It's got a nice little box behind it. It's a $5,000 or $6,000 package, and you're off and running, and you can do 20 or 30 servers with a fair degree of accuracy, certainly greater than anything any of the requirements put forward by the regulators are there. Obviously, if you're a large global trading firm with 1,000 locations worldwide, the price is higher. But again, it's an antenna, it's a grandmaster. Relative to what you invested in servers, it's just not going to hit the budget that hard or noticeable at the end of the day compared to everything else you're spending money on.
And what do you lose if you don't push the edge? If you're not at the microsecond level, for example, even though you don't have to be legally, What do you lose? Is there a financial cost?
Well, there will, because at the end of the day, you have to compete with all the other firms on the street, many of whom will go with very precise timing, and they will use that to sharpen their trading algorithms to a high degree of precision. So you will simply not achieve any alpha in the market because everyone else is going to be able to trade more efficiently and more effectively than you. You will be trading on old news or news that's out of place in time, or even simple market data misplaced in time. So your odds of achieving any kind of growth in your market share is not going to be good at that point. So there's a real financial impact. As I said when I opened, I think the way to look at timing is it's about how do I help this generate revenue? How do I seek alpha? And it's all about doing the synchronized timing to improve my trading algorithms. And if I do all that and take the revenue from that, on the back end, the compliance issues go away because those are much softer, gentler numbers relative to what I want to do for my trading environment in general. And I think I'm getting the flashing red light up here, so I'll get down. Pleasure as always, sir.
Great.
Oh, thank you.